Welcome to this session, and in this class we will spend some time trying to have a very broad overview of the life of Karl Marx. We will not be going into any of the specific discussions or any specific contributions of Marxian theory, but I thought I will spend some time trying to provide you a very broad description, broad overview of the man, the political activist, the philosopher, the revolutionary, and one of the most profound intellectuals of modern times. And I hope you would agree with me that teaching Karl Marx through a couple of lectures is an impossible task. It's an extremely difficult exercise to introduce a thinker like Karl Marx in a short span of time, given the breadth of his analysis, the amount of writings, the amount of commentaries that have been made on Marxian analysis, on Marxian theories, the divergent views on Marx, and the enormous impact that Marxian thinking or Marxian theories had on the later development of political and social theory. But anyway, we would spend some time trying to understand the man and the nature of his intellectual work. So here are a few pictures. The first one is the picture of the young Marx, and the last one is a more familiar picture. And in the middle we have Karl Marx with his wife Jenny, and these are some of the documentaries that you can easily available on YouTube. Who Was Karl Marx, a DW documentary, which provides a broad overview of Marxian contribution. Then Masters of Money, the BBC documentary, which mostly focuses on a Marxian interpretation of capitalism, and that's a very popular, very important documentary. Then you have this Marxist Thought, Past and Present, again a documentary that looks at the relevance of Marxian theory in the contemporary times. And I would also suggest you to have a detailed look at this Marxist.org, a website, a repository of a whole lot of important Marxian literature. You will find Marxist original writings. You will find quite a lot of literature on Marx. So along with these materials, there are quite a lot of interesting commentaries and writings and criticisms and other elaborations on Karl Marx. So finding materials to understand the contributions of Karl Marx is not difficult. So just a couple of slides on his personal life. Karl Marx was born in Germany. The theorist and the revolutionary. He was a Jew, as many of you might know. He was born to Heinrich and Henrietta Marx on May 5th, 1818 in the city of Trier in Germany. And during his lifetime, he was exiled from Germany, France and Belgium, eventually settled in London 1849, where he lived until his death in 1883. And anybody with a cursory understanding of of Karl Marx's life would know that he was a political activist. He was a revolutionary who believed that the socialist revolution is only a matter of time, and who believed that as a scholar it is his fundamental obligation not only to think and theorize about the society, but to change it as well. So in that sense, he was a political activist. He spent most of his time in writing political propaganda and in actively organizing workers. So that is exactly the reason why he was expelled from his own motherland, Germany, from France and Belgium, and eventually he had to settle down in London, and where he ultimately died. And yeah, he studied philosophy, history and law at the universities of Bonn and Berlin, received his doctorate in 1841 and eventually became fluent in 8 languages. And this is something about his towering intellectual life, a person who had extremely wide reading habit, extremely wide scholarship on a wide variety of topics in philosophy, in history and in law, and became fluent in 8 languages. And another very interesting thing that shapes his intellectual and political life was his friendship with Friedrich Engels, who became his lifelong colleague and benefactor. We all know that this famous work, the Communist Manifesto, was written by Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx together, and Engels played a very, very important role both in his intellectual life as well as his personal life. Especially towards the end of his life, the economic condition of Marx was something very, very, it was in a very bad shape, and he mostly survived on the contribution or the money that was sent by Friedrich Engels, and their friendship is something very unique, something very special. And he encountered a very difficult personal life. He survived the death of his 4 children and many times was in acute poverty. So some of his writings on their condition is something very emotional. You'll feel extremely bad about the kind of situation that Marx had to endure for leading a very active political life, the kind of sacrifices that he had to make. So I'm not going into the details of his personal life because that's well available in the public domain. Those who are interested to know the kind of biography, there are several biographies written on Marx, and these are easily available in the internet or in other libraries. I'm not going into the details. Now let us come to the kind of intellectual, the nature of Karl Marx as an intellectual. How do we place him? How do we describe him? How do we make sense of the man? How do we make sense of his intellectual life, his intellectual contribution? Again, not an easy task because he was an extremely complicated person, an extremely complicated intellectual. Even now, even after these many years, the kind of debates and discussions and controversies about Marxian thought have not completely settled down. So he was a philosopher primarily, a political activist who believed in changing the world. And this is something, one of the most important thing that distinguishes Karl Marx from the rest of the social theorists whom we have discussed so far or whom we are going to discuss hereafter. In a way, Karl Marx is uncomparable with his peers in social sciences or in economics because he was preliminarily or he was primarily somebody, a scholar, who also was equally a political activist. And this is one of his very famous sayings, very famous quotations. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. Okay, so it's an extremely important point because he is not discounting the role of philosophers. Of course, being a philosopher himself, being a theorist himself, he is not able to, or he will not discount the role of philosophy or the need to reflect or theorize the kind of situation. But more importantly, what he argued is that you need to understand it, you need to interpret the world, but never leave it there. You need to change it. He never believed that the role of an academic, the role of an intellectual is to be an armchair theorist. He never believed that. He always believed that a theorist must work among the people, and Marx had a particular vision about what should be the nature of this work, what should be the nature of a political activism, and what should be the ultimate destiny of mankind, what should be the kind of changes in which every human society must undergo. So you can criticize, we can disagree with that kind of understanding about the world, but personally he believed that he committed his entire life for the kind of an activism for which he had to pay a huge price. As we have just mentioned, he was expelled from various countries and his financial condition was very bad, and he never had a kind of a settled life. He never had a proper job in that sense of the world. He became a journalist. He worked as a freelance writer, as a journalist. So in that sense, he was somebody who really practiced what he always preached. He was an economist, he was a historian, he was a political scientist, he was a sociologist, and again this is something quite unusual. You will not find many other scholars whom we can describe in this particular manner. whether it is Durkheim or Weber or the people whom we discussed in the previous classes, including Herbert Spencer or Auguste Comte or Tocqueville. These were all people whom we can easily categorize as a philosopher or as a sociologist or as an economist. But the intellectual interest of Karl Marx, the intellectual, the magnitude of his intellectual endeavors, the breadth of his knowledge, it really surpassed all these disciplinary boundaries from philosophy to history to political science to sociology and a host of other disciplines. It is also extremely important to note that the relevance of Marxian theories or his contributions were relevant or topical only during his particular time. They became extremely influential, they became extremely powerful even after his death. And we have very, very powerful theoretical orientations known as Marxian theories and then critical theory that were heavily inspired and influenced by the Marxian thinking. So in that sense, the relevance of Karl Marx, as we will discuss in the coming classes, did not end with the writing of Marx. Rather, it resulted in a proliferation of other ideas, other theories, because there were theorists who were extremely influenced, enchanted, I would even use the word enchanted by Marxian thinking and Marxian writing, and they improved upon Marxian theory. I think they revised Marxian theory, and most of those endeavors resulted in the emergence of this Marxian and critical theory as very discernible theoretical orientations in the later decades. So, he was a theorist primarily of a capitalist system and account for its origin, its historical stability and its eventual demise. Of course, a prophecy which did not come true, a prophecy in which Marx very miserably failed, but we will see that in the coming class how and why that he put the capitalist system, he placed the capitalist system at the center of his analysis, and how incisive that was, how powerful that was, and his entire preoccupation with this capitalist system as a defining feature of the modern society, and a towering intellectual. I don't know how to elaborate it further, given the kind of enormous influence that Karl Marx had on all these disciplines and in the academic field in almost virtually every country in the world for past several generations. So, if you look into the amount of his writings, they are voluminous. There is huge body of knowledge that Marx has written, and also which is making it more difficult is the kind of type of writing that he had. He has this proper academic writing, especially as you see in his latter writings like the 3 volumes of Capital. They are very hardcore economic analysis like any other seasoned academician would do. But he also was a journalist, so that you will come across a host of journalistic writing. And he was also a political activist, and he has written extensively materials which has a very strong polemical character. Arguments or articles which are aimed to criticize other people very ruthlessly, to defend one's own position, to humiliate others, to criticize others, to expose others. So you will find a combination of all these 3 extremely different types of writings in Marxian writings, starting from very argumentative polemical thing to more journalistic writing to more systematic, deeper theoretical academic writing. So a person combining all these 3 forms of writing is again an unusual scenario in the overall scenario of academic life. And many writings of Marx were published after his death, including the 2nd and 3rd volumes of Capital, and they were recovered from his notes and manuscripts. And Karl Marx was infamous for his very ugly, unreadable, handwriting. So that itself proved to be a major challenge. And many of his writings were in the form of scribbles, small notes which were never elaborated. So there was a lot of lack of clarity regarding exactly what he meant in many of his notes and then writings and other things. So Friedrich Engels played a very important role in translating many of this material. So there is a huge amount of controversy, huge amount of discussions about what exactly he meant and whether he meant one particular argument or not in those directions. So as a result, you will find quite a lot of contradictions, inconsistencies in his writings. And this is bound to happen when a person writes so much. A person writes when at a much younger age, and when he writes even at the fag end of his life. When somebody writes as an academic, when somebody writes as a journalist, as a polemic, as a political activist, you will find that it's very difficult to maintain kind of a consistency and lack of contradiction. So there are various themes and terms which are left undefined. Marx has, or there are a lot of lack of clarity, or there are even seeming contradictions in many times. And the tension between Karl Marx as a scholar and Marx as an activist is very profound. As I told you earlier, these two are entirely different type of engagement. As a scholar, you can be extremely meticulous, you have to be extremely careful, you have to be you need to go deeper into a given topic, whereas that approach will not suit when you are an activist, where you need to simplify things, you need to make it more conducive for a mass appeal, you need to reshape it, or you need to rehash it for a kind of a popular consumption. So these Marx was not able to really come out of this particular tension, which is very, very natural. And again, another matter or another factor which complicates the legacy of Marx is the huge body of academic and political commentaries on the writings of Marx. So it's not only that what Marx has written by himself, but as I told you, there is a huge body of literature available by his followers, his disciples, other theorists who were influenced by Marxian thought, and his own predecessors. And there's a very famous quoting, or there's a very famous saying or quote from Marx that after seeing some of his very, very distorted arguments by his disciples, Marx was supposed to have said that I am not a Marxist. So you will see that there are very different shades of Marxism developed earlier, some very fundamentalist in its character, some very rigid kind of Marxism. So I'm not going into that, but this is an extremely important aspect, that the latter commentaries on Marx really play a very important role in making these complications and confusions. And another very important part is that Marxian writing became official ideology and propaganda of communist states, whether it is China or in Russia or a host of other countries in the left bloc. And we know that the moment a particular academic or particular theoretical work becomes a part of a statist agenda, whether it is communist or capitalist or any other thing, then distortions are bound to happen. So when an academic contribution or a theory is being channelized into propaganda, then it loses quite a lot of its character, because you can't have a propaganda with ambiguity. You can't have a propaganda with more open-ended inquiry. The propaganda has to be very, very closed. It has to be very, 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 very unidirectional. And so the kind of an intricate power relation between the communist states and the arguments of Karl Marx played a very important role to a large extent in distorting or in giving a unique direction to his writings. And another very useful or very widely prevailed intervention to understand Marxian writings is this distinction between this young Marx and the matured Marx, a kind of distinction that is widely accepted by scholars, where the young Marx is supposedly the kind of writings by Marx when he was in a more youthful age, comprising of his writings of Karl Marx between 1841 and 1848, and the matured Marx is supposed to be the latter. And when you talk about the young Marx, you will see he is more philosophical, because that's the time when he's fighting with the young Hegelians, and then he's fighting with Hegelian idea. So you will see a person who is more politically oriented, more philosophical, who is more romantic, and who writes on a host of issues like alienation and religion and other things. Whereas the matured Marx is more clinical in his approach. He's more scientific in his approach, and he discusses mostly with with more substantial issues like capitalism and other things. So a host of writings like Introduction to the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Law, The Jewish Question, The Poverty Philosophy, and this poverty philosophy is a major rebuttal to one of his young Hegelians. And Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844, the German Ideology, the Communist Manifesto. So all these are the writings which are usually attributed as the writings of this young Marx, whereas the 3 volumes of Capital and Contributions to the Critique of Political Economy are considered to be his substantial work, which are attributed to the matured Marx. So we can say, even without an iota of doubt, that Marx continues to be relevant today. Marx continues to be important today. Of course, we know that his prophecy about the demise of capitalism did not come true. Capitalism thrived. Capitalism proved to be the most resilient of the economic systems that human society has witnessed so far. So in that sense, there are a lot of people who believe that Marx no longer has any relevance. But that's not the case, because his critique of capitalism is extremely important. There is no other economist, there is no other scholar who has dissected and understood the inherent logic of capitalism like Karl Marx. There's no better scholar on capitalism than Karl Marx. And capitalism, it continues to be important. It continues to be the most dominant form of economic activity, economic framework, especially with the collapse of the Soviet bloc. At the same time, we know that capitalism is not free from its contradictions. There are quite a lot of scholars who are extremely skeptical about the longevity of capitalism as a particular system because of various reasons. And again, if you look into some of the primary contributions of Karl Marx, his foregrounding of the material conditions and economy as the primary focus of analysis is something extremely important. He was the first scholar, or he is the most profound scholar who vehemently argued to foreground the economic angle, or the questions of materiality, the questions of production, the questions of material condition into your frame of analysis. So whether the moment you try to understand the contemporary society against a whole set of later academic trends that that valorize, that foreground culture and ideologies and other things, Marx would repeatedly remind you to focus on these conditions of materiality, conditions of production, conditions of economy, the way in which different sections of people are entangled in this whole process of economic production. And that is an extremely important, invaluable focus which provides you with quite a lot of insights and understandings about the way in which a society functions. And he was a person who was concerned with the questions of class inequality. No other scholar for that matter can come anywhere near to his genuine concern about the questions of class inequality. So we know that class inequality is not only a situation that different classes are positioned differently, but it has very specific empirical consequences. Inequality generates its own set of consequences in terms of access to certain resources, in terms of access to certain life conditions, life chances, and a host of other issues. So Marx, one of the fundamental engagements of Karl Marx was this whole question of class inequality, and from there his commitment to the ideals of equality, justice, and human emancipation. He was personally extremely concerned with the question of equality, with justice, and an idea of emancipation, of human emancipation. maybe it looks very vague. This term emancipation looks very vague. What does one mean by the whole idea of a human emancipation? It looks very vague, but it's a very enchanting idea that you dream of a more egalitarian society. You dream about a society where human beings are treated equally. That is an extremely powerful imagination. That's an extremely powerful dream. And in the social science circles, Karl Marx is the one who really, really, came up with that dream. He was the one who was the most advocate of that particular imagination and that particular kind of dream. So in that sense, Marx was not only he was not a dry academic who could understand and analyze things in a very impassionate manner. He never claimed to be neutral. He never claimed to be, impassionate or objective objectivist in that particular sense. He very specifically, he very consciously, deliberately took side. He stood with the people who were less privileged. He stood with the proletariat. He stood with the workers. He stood with the poor, and that was his political commitment. So, Karl Marx appears as a person with unique political commitment, unique intellectual faculties, and an extraordinary intellectual. So I will end here. We will discuss more specific contributions of Karl Marx in the coming classes. Thank you.